So I'd like to welcome everyone to our 2022 Annual Technology Baseline webinar today. Thank you so much for coming. So this is the update of the electricity part of the Annual Technology Baseline. The transportation part of the Annual Technology Baseline is undergoing updates, but those are not being released at this time. Those will be forthcoming later on. So before I launch in, I'd really like to thank all of the wonderful folks on the team whose names are mentioned here. This is a collaborative effort between NREL, the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and the US Department of Energy Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management to provide the technical expertise on all of the technologies in the ATB, and we're sponsored by the US DOE EERE office for pulling this together and the leadership on the Annual Technology Baseline overall. So thank you very much to the team. So today I'll be talking about the overview of the ATB. My colleague Brian Mirletz will present the updates, and then David Feldman will discuss the financial cases. We'll have some Q&A here during this session, and then also additional Q&A during the breakout groups. So before I launch in, I just want to be sure, can everyone see my screen and hear me okay?
Perfect.
Okay, great, thank you. So starting off, so why the ATB? Why do we pull this together? So we're really trying to help provide some better understanding of technology progress and technology innovation. So we're drawing on experts from the national labs and the Department of Energy to try to make sense of a changing and a potentially confusing landscape of technology innovation. We want to try to pull everything together that's relevant to electricity projections in the long term into a single data set that's useful for modeling and analysis. So we're hoping that this product contributes to a better understanding of cost and performance during the next 30 years. The ATB is used in a variety of NREL products. Some of them are shown here. So we, when we conduct a forecasting analysis and look at how the energy system might evolve over time, the ATB scenarios often form a starting point. So one question that often comes up is kind of what the scope is of the ATB relative to these other products. And I think it's really important to recognize that ATB houses the data and provides opportunities to view the data and explain the data. But there's a lot more that goes into an electricity system analysis than the data about technology innovation. So how these technologies fit into the entire system are questions that are delved into in other models, such as our capacity expansion model, the REEDS model, such as the resource planning model. So those types of models take into account a lot of other factors that influence how effective the technologies actually are within the electricity system. And kind of on the other end, distinct from planning the whole entire electricity system, like in REEDS and RPM, the system advisor model or the REOPT model are models that are more site specific and system specific. And so while ATB coordinates with those and those models may use some of the data in ATB, if you are specifically planning a particular installation, other factors that are considered in those kinds of models may be useful to you as well. So while we think ATB has many applications. It does not do everything. And we'd be happy to entertain questions about ATB relative to related tools at any time. And the resource breakout group will also highlight how ATB relates to kind of the resource perspective. So many folks use the ATB, many different types of organizations really appreciate all of the use, and we're delighted that this is useful to the many different types of organizations. This is not a comprehensive list. So this is an example of how ATB forms a building block for other activities. So one of the key activities that NREL does also on an annual basis is to develop standard scenarios for the electricity sector, for the future of the electricity sector. And the standard scenarios use the annual technology baseline scenarios as a starting point, but definitely not as an ending point. One of the great questions that we got from our user survey was kind of how does ATB address sustainability? And ATB does not really address sustainability, but when you take the ATB and put it into analyses such as the standard scenarios, those may output sustainability metrics. So just like to emphasize that ATB is a starting point for many other types of analyses. So the ATB includes a whole set of products. So we have the spreadsheet, which will be featured in one of our breakout groups, the web application, the website, which will be featured in the website application or breakout group, various structured data products, interactive charts on the website, Tableau workbook, formatted data, and an API. Those will all be in the spreadsheets and data breakout group, and also this PowerPoint. So hopefully among these various products is one that will be useful to you. And if there's something else that would be useful to you, we always welcome ideas. So one question that has also come in from our users is, what are appropriate and inappropriate uses of the ATB? So, we can provide these products. It's hard for us to review, studies that anybody might do with these, and we don't really do that. So if you're designing a study and using these products, I highly recommend, digging into some of the details of what these are and what they are not. One challenge is, or I guess one feature of the ATB is that it's really a portal to a lot of additional detail. So there is a lot of citation of detailed reports within the website. The website has a comprehensive list of references for each page, and also those are consolidated into a longer reference list. So if you're designing a study using the ATB, highly recommend that you dig into some of those details to understand the documentation. I will say that one common challenge across this data set is that folks like to use a levelized cost of energy to compare technologies. And the levelized cost of energy is an interesting high-level metric for that purpose, but may easily be applied to purposes that really require consideration of more factors. So the ATB takes these metrics of capital cost, operations and maintenance cost, and capacity factors, and calculates an LCOE for what it's worth. So please carefully consider the application of LCOE, what it is, what it isn't, what it doesn't take into account, before you apply it broadly. Many people use, just portions of the ATB. So, maybe they are interested in the CapEx projections, but find the O&M or the capacity factor projections or categories don't apply to their situation. And that's totally fine. But just, if you're doing an analysis, recommend being very thoughtful about what you use. So in the terms of ATB technology coverage, we have the usual technologies from before, and we also have several new ones. Very excited to offer new distributed wind technology this year, as well as CapEx for the pump storage hydropower. And then we're also pulling in from EIA the small modular reactor on the nuclear side. So the other technologies on this chart are technologies where the national labs in this project are not developing a separate projection of technology innovation. We are relying on the EIA's annual energy outlook for those other technologies. So the ATB essentially applies the methodology shown here. So first, we take each technology and categorize it into bins. So we have a representative technology and a variety of performance of that technology. We then develop cost and performance data for each of those bins. And finally, we use that to calculate LCOE. So the technology bins are shown here. And as you can see, there are the bins are made often based on resource quality, but not entirely based on resource quality. Some of the binning also has a technological dimension. So one question that really commonly comes up is, I have a project, that's in a specific place. What resource quality should I assume for my particular place? So this is where it's really important to understand the limitations of the ATB. So the ATB does not take into account the full continuous set of resource quality like you might see in the map. The ATB is binning resource quality and then taking a single representative value for each of those bins. So this is where, if you have site-specific resource quality questions, the ATB is not the place to start. You want to be looking into the specific resource data and then probably also one of our more site-specific models. However, for the broad overview of resource quality across the whole US at this kind of high level, the ATB does a great job of kind of summarizing what the different performance is. So ATB has these three scenarios for technology innovation. And this technology innovation in the long term is really the primary focus of what ATB is doing. So we're looking across the research and development space across national labs and the Department of Energy, and trying to assess what technology innovations might change the cost and performance of these technologies in the long term. The descriptions of the three scenarios are shown here, and these are widely used in NREL studies. Behind these scenarios and all these assumptions are a lot of references, and the references are all on the website. And then the last step in our process is to take all the assumptions and put them into this high-level metric of the levelized cost of energy. So that's the end of the overview part. I'll turn it to my colleague, Brian Mirletz, in just a moment. I did want to answer a couple of key questions that came through from our registered users before the webinar. So one question that often comes up is, what's the base year for all these dollar values? What's the dollar year, rather? And that dollar year always corresponds to our base year, which is has historically always been 2 years before the year of publication. And that's due to the time that it takes for all of the publications to come together. So it's the 2022 ATB, the dollar year is 2020. Another question that has come from our registered users is whether the ATB will add other technologies, and that's something that we consider every year, and we develop a list of what we are going to add and what we are not. The types of things that we are unlikely to add is a whole lot of detailed breakout of specific types of configurations of any given technology. So that's something that we certainly get asked, but that's not a direction that we're likely to go, because this is a much higher level summary. And with that, Brian, I think, it looks like there's some requests to respond to some of the questions in the chat. So was that from you, Nate?
Yeah, that was from me. I'm happy to respond to a couple of these if that's good with everyone else. I've forgotten the status on when we're answering those chat questions.
If there's something that you think is important to get established here at the overview stage, that would be great.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
So does that mean you're going or not?
I've responded.
Oh, okay. Okay. So Brian, I think you're up.
Yeah, great. Let's go to the next slide. So this summarizes the technology-specific updates for the 2022 annual technology baseline. Typically, the technology analysts are publishing all of their cost analysis reports, some on an annual basis, some less frequently. But when those new cost reports are coming out, we're including these in the data. I'm not going to read through this whole slide, but if you want to dive into the details on any of these, that's available in the approach and methodology section and changes in 2022 sections of the about pages of the website. Next slide. During the webinar today, we're going to highlight 5 technologies with what we view are significant changes. So distributed wind is new to the 2022 ATB, so we'll be hearing about that first. Geothermal had some updates that reduced the CapEx, and then some new reports for utility scale PV plus battery, battery storage, and pumped storage hydropower. Next slide. So at this point, I'll hand things off to Parangat for distributed wind.
Thanks, Brian. Hey everyone, good to be presenting here. As Brian mentioned, distributed wind is being added for the first time to the ATB, and a major study that was just released this year made that possible, the distributed wind features study. Through the study, we looked at what are the current cost and performance characteristics of distributed wind, and what will they look like 10, 15, and up until 2050 in the future. Yeah, and is there a next slide, Brian? So as you can see here, these were the cost projections that were developed for the distributed wind futures study. Essentially, we took the cost and performance projections that were developed back in 2015 in the DOE's wind vision study coupled with the 2016 NREL study, the behind the meter distributed wind feature study. So as I said, we took the learning curves that were developed under those studies and updated the cost and performance to 2020 numbers, and then reapplied those learning curves to get these new cost and performance projections up until the year 2050. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah, well, yeah, that's basically the gist of it, but happy to answer any questions as they arrive from folks.
So we'll give folks a few seconds to put any burning questions into the Q&A or chat, but otherwise there is, Pankaj will be at the wind breakout session, so he can go into much more detail there. I'm not seeing anything in the chat right now, so I think we'll move on to geothermal. Jody Robbins was our analyst for geothermal this year, so he's not available today, and I'll be covering the geothermal technology. So the major changes for geothermal this year were to lower O&M costs on the basis of additional empirical data. And then while the overnight capital cost hasn't changed in most of the scenarios, especially the advanced scenario represents a lower CapEx due to shorter construction timelines. Everything here is based on the GITM model, and then some of these improvements, especially for the EGS tech details, have been reflected in the projections as well. So I think the default technology for EGS in 2030 has been updated to a 100 megawatt plant instead of a smaller plant from previous years. Next slide. So this shows that default scenario for hydroflash technology and how the different scenarios evolve between now and 2050. Next slide. And then this shows the year-over-year changes. So again, we had that decrease in fixed O&M based on empirical data, which produced a resulting decrease in LCOE for geothermal.
So Brian, how do I tell what dollar year these numbers are in?
Right, so all of the dollar years presented in the 2022 ATB are 2020 real dollars. So if you're looking for a nominal number for say 2030, we would recommend you apply an inflation forecast that you get from somewhere else in order to do that. Our default inflation is 2.5%. So we can discuss maybe at one of the breakout sessions or during the financial session how that's applied in the spreadsheets. Right, I'm not seeing any geothermal specific questions in the Q&A, so we'll go ahead and move on to the next technology. I think Vignesh is covering utility scale PV plus battery.
That's correct. Thanks, Brian. Good morning, everyone. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Vignesh Ramasamy. I'm a techno-economic analyst at Distributed Systems and Storage Group, predominantly focusing on benchmarking United States average cost for PV and battery storage systems across different sectors. So today I'll be focusing on the high level summary about the PV plus battery ATB projections for this year. So for this year's ATB, the base year system capital cost for standalone PV and battery and also utility scale PV plus battery systems were estimated using the bottom-up system cost model that we used to present the Q1 2021 system cost benchmark values in the annual benchmark report published at the end of last year. We assume the federal tax credit for batteries is one of the primary motivation for UPV plus battery installations. As a part of that, we assume 75% of the total energy that goes into the battery every year comes from the coupled PV system, and the remaining 25% of the energy comes from the grid. So you can see in the ATB website in detail for all the different assumptions around the ITC qualification. And also in 2021, I would like to point out that we made several improvements to the battery system cost model. One of the improvements is to represent cost in terms of both nameplate and usable capacity. So nameplate capacity is the capacity achieved after overbuilding the rated capacity at which the system will operate after the state of charge limitations and round trip efficiency loss. So we assume the system with a 130 megawatt PV capacity alongside a battery with 55 megawatt usable capacity of 4-hour duration and with an interconnection capacity of 100 megawatts. Also in the updated model, the interconnection transmission cost calculations are updated to calculate the cost based off AC rating rather than the DC rating. And the fixed O&M cost would include 20% capacity augmentation cost at year 10 and 20 for the batteries. On top of that, the final LCOE estimate includes a $22 per megawatt hour cost for the 25% grid charging I mentioned earlier. And as far as this year's PV plus battery ATB projection goes, like last year, the reduction rates are primarily driven not only by capacity cost reductions, the CapEx cost reductions, but also assumes an R&D effort improvement and investments that would lead to longer system lifetime and improved performance. Next slide, please. So you can see all the three different scenarios on this slide. Basically, the conservative scenario shows you, reflects the lower levels of R&D investment compared to what we have today with minimal technology advancement. And the moderate level scenario, it shows R&D investment continuing at similar levels as of today with current industry technology roadmaps, achieved, but without any substantial innovations or new technologies introduced to the market. And the advanced scenario, shows an increase in R&D spending that generates the substantial innovation, allowing historical rates of development to continue. The capacity factor of the utility scale PV plus battery systems is a function of the capacity factor of PV and battery components, assuming a certain amount of battery energy is charged from the coupled PV systems, like I discussed before. Next slide, please. And with the increase in capacity factor, could say the LCOE has dropped compared to the 2020 projections, so the 2021 projections, and also the CapEx stayed close to last year's projection. And then the fixed O&M, also kind of stayed closer to the last year's projection. That's it from me.
Thank you. Yeah, let's see. I think let's give folks a second to type any PV plus battery questions into the chat. I think Vignesh will be at the energy storage breakout session after the main webinar in case you have additional questions there.
Sure.
Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And I'll hand things off to Nate Blair.
Thank you, Brian. Happy to be here today and excited to talk about utility scale battery storage. And it's great that we just had Vignesh talking, because Vignesh was critical to the update for this year on utility scale battery storage, in addition to helping last year. So I think key things is, just like last year, we are continuing to share both utility scale, commercial scale, and residential scale battery systems. And the methodology is similar to what was done last year. Last year was a big change from the year before, and it stems from our work in the NREL storage futures study primarily, but in combination with the ongoing work supported by the Solar Office on solar plus storage system cost analysis that Vignesh was referring to. Next slide. As you can see here, we maintain a consistent capacity factor for these storage systems, and we anticipate, as we did last year, ongoing CapEx reduction and fixed O&M reduction across all of these. The primary difference from last year to this year at the utility scale was, as with the commercial and residential scale, is updated 2020 cost numbers and reapplication of the future projections and literature search that we have updated for this year as well. Next slide. The both the CapEx and capacity factor and fixed O&M continue to go down. One thing I would note on this slide is that in the near term, as I think was alluded to in the introduction, costs are going up. And so it's important to note that these are 2020 costs. The 2021 and kind of into 2022, we anticipate, for a variety of reasons, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, increases in battery costs. And so next year, we might see an uptick in the current costs, but we still anticipate, as do other organizations, a decrease in future battery pack costs as that market continues to expand. Next slide, please.
I think actually, if we could stay on that slide, I think there's two questions that would be good to address at this point. So one is talking about the difference in, or basically with an eye to our methodology in the base year. Why is the 2020 storage CapEx so different from the 2020 number from the 2021 ATB? Does that make sense? Why is the first point on the red line above the green line, so far above the green line?
Yeah, and that's a good point. And I would say that that we are starting to see some of those variations in costs, even in the 2020 numbers, as we move through a couple of really constraining forces. One is supply chain difficulties combined with massive market demand, both for EV batteries as well as grid scale batteries. And as our market here in the US starts to respond to some of these global pressures. So, and we will see even more of an uptick likely next year, as I was indicating.
Thanks. So yeah, just to comment on the ATB methodology overall, when we talk about the base year of the ATB, for this year, that's 2020, and that's the year for which sufficient historical data are available for us to publish peer-reviewed and thoroughly reviewed numbers. So there is a little bit of a lag between what's happening in the market and the numbers that we're publishing here. But then in terms of why the numbers are different between, so that lag explains why the numbers are different between the 2021's ATB's number for 2020, which as Parthiv said in the chat, is a projection based on that 2019 base year, versus this year's 2020 number, which is based on that market data. Another question for either Nate or Vignesh, could you speak to about the change in fixed O&M or variable and O&M on battery cycling, for example, if you're cycling twice per day?
Vignesh, I'm going to let you take that if you have a ready answer.
Sure. I mean, if you'd like to see how it impacts the LCOE calculation with the change in the fixed and variable O&M cost, I think it can be done via the spreadsheet model that has been developed. Like, instead of the 1 cycle per day energy throughput assumption that we have in the model, you could, change it to 2 cycles per day and see how it impacts the LCOE overall. But right now, the assumption is based on, the base year model that has is based on 1 cycle per day. So you could change those values in the spreadsheet model and see how it impacts the LCOE, if that's what you're getting at the end.
Thank you. And then one more on battery storage. I think Laura addressed hydrogen in the chat, but I just wanted to get a quick answer from Nate on storage technologies besides lithium ion. So for example, iron air.
Yeah, I know that's a good question, and we are fielding offline, separate from the ATB, a lot of questions around long duration storage in particular these days. And I would point people to a couple of reports, one of which is the NREL Standard Scenarios Report, Model Inputs Report. There's 7 reports. Model Inputs Report, we talk a little bit about a range of long other duration technologies and other storage technologies. Secondly, Pacific Northwest National Lab, in conjunction with DOE, has put out several other storage cost reports, which are a mix of techno-economic analysis and interviews with industry as well. I would say we aren't confident yet enough in the commercial scale of a number of these technologies to provide that data in the ATB. But as those technologies continue to evolve and become commercial, and there are multiple plants available, we would consider adding them, of course, into the ATB in the future.
Thank you. All right, at this point, I think we'll move on to pumped storage hydropower. So unfortunately, Stuart couldn't make the main webinar, but he will be available at the breakout session to answer any more detailed questions. We did present some O&M numbers for pumped storage hydropower last year. This year, we're including capital cost data for the first time. And this is based on a first of its kind resource assessment that has site level information. So for the ATB, we've sorted this down to 15 representative classes. But if you dig into the reports that are linked here, you can find that full supply curve. And then projections for this technology included in the advanced scenario are based on the 2016 Hydrowire study. Next slide. So this shows the defaults for pumped storage hydropower. And you can see that new CapEx data for the representative class in that top bin. And if there aren't any questions on pumped storage hydropower, we can either answer them in the chat or at the breakout session. Let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. And at this point, I'll hand things off to David Feldman.
Thanks so much. Let me know if you can't hear me. If we could go to the next slide. So we're going to cover a little bit of our financial assumptions and just, I may probably reiterate a lot of the good things that Laura and Brian and all were talking about. So just as sort of a point of clarification, as mentioned, our base year is 2020, the dollar year is 2020. And historical data include data reported in 2020. So the general approaches for our financial assumptions are similar to what was done last year. There are 2 financial cases. There's an R&D and a market and policies case. The difference being the R&D case, well, the market and policy cases include 2 distinct things. One, they include the tax credits for the renewable technologies. And they also include an assumption that that interest rates are going to go up over time. So those are the primary differences. They're both assume what we would, based off of research, common, typical financing arrangements in the U.S. So I think they're all based off of IPP approach. And that's sort of how we modeled, again, a typical typical financial cases for each. We could go to the next slide. So again, covering a bit of what was said before, but just also I'll be brief, but just some clarifications, you know, or just some note that we're trying to better articulate this year what the ATB is and what it isn't. So we're trying to better articulate the sources of our projections, and sort of what they mean. So, you know, I believe all of them, or at least most of the projections, have a historical data and then long-term trends, and there are typically trend lines between the two. So we're not predicting, for example, what the price of solar is in 2023. We're saying this is the historical data, these are the long-term trends, and we're doing a trend line. We don't get into sort of what particular things are going to happen between historical data and 2030. Similarly, we don't reflect every condition in our projection. So there are local, and Laura covered this, there are local things that might change about a specific project, either regionally or nationally. We do a lot of either national averages or trends or regional trends, but we don't get into specific variations on local variations to the same degree. And that's the same could be said about the financing assumptions. These are typical financing assumptions. There are a host of ways that projects are financed. We're just looking at typical ones. And then we're just trying to provide clarity about you know, the ATB purpose. So we're trying to provide you know, a resource for folks who are doing conducting scenario analysis, looking at 5 to 30 years into the future. And so that's really the intention. We're not trying to predict what the price of anything is next year. And we're trying to document it and make it transparent and normalize so that people can look at technology, different technologies in a consistent way. We're also, again, we've replaced current with the more precise wording. So we're trying to be more exact about what we are doing and what we're not doing. So if we can go to the next slide. So I'm just going to cover briefly, and we can get into more of it in the finance breakout section, but there's some of the reasons why the finances change between technologies and where they come from. So namely the investment in production tax credits, how term debt fraction changes, how that impacts, and other things impact the weighted average cost of capital in real terms, and LCOE. So if we go to the next slide, you can see these are assumptions for different technologies as far as their tax credits. So obviously they vary based off of the law. We make some assumptions because this is about when a project is placed in service, and for various technologies, you have to assume a construction timeline and how people are financing these things and how long the tax credit lasts. So you can see offshore wind has the full 30% tax credit through 2035, I believe, because there's an assumption that you can maintain construction for I think 10 years and be safe harbor. That's the sort of do similar things for PV and wind, and which is not at that time length. So those are assumptions, and those have an impact on how things are financed. So if we go to the next slide, we did some analysis, and you know, when you have tax credits in the financing, that affects how much debt is involved is on a project. So you can see the debt fraction going up over time, and that's what that in the market and policies case, what that indicates is that as the tax credits are sort of slowly phased down, the more debt can be on a project. So yeah, and then if you could see in the R&D case, there are no tax credits, so these things don't change, but you can see that across technologies, due to specific technology characteristics, that the amount of debt that one can put on a project varies. Go to the next slide. So again, you can see that the weighted average cost of capital also changes. Debt is typically cheaper than equity, or it is. We perceive that, and we've assumed that in our cases. And you can see that the cost of capital, which is the WACC, which is what we use for discounting for LCOE purposes, it goes down over time, at least for the first 5 years generally, because the tax credits are going down, so there's more debt on a project, which is cheaper, so the cost of capital is going down. You can also see it slowly going up after that because we assume that the interest rates are going to rise in the long term. And it's also worth noting, you can see that there's differences in WACC, and that's due to 3 factors. One, we vary the interest rates by technology, we vary debt fraction by technology, and we vary the cost of equity by technology. So that's going to obviously impact the weighting of those things. And with the R&D case, those things don't change, so we don't vary, but they do vary by technology. So we go to the last slide. You can see the left, the market case. You can see that the LCOE varies by technology, and you can see that for some things it goes up. The cost of equity goes up at certain points in time. And while we talked about how the WACC is getting cheaper, but that's sort of offset by the tax credits going away. So people use the tax credits for a reason. So that's what you see there, and versus the R&D case, where I think for all of them we project long-term technology improvements, therefore reduction in the cost of equity. I think that's it, and if there are any specific questions, we can get into the breakout section.
Thanks so much, Dave. And I would just emphasize that these financial assumptions are one reason why, other entities, utilities, whoever's making financial decisions, they may want to use their own financial assumptions. And in any specific project, that's certainly appropriate. So ATB assumptions in this arena are really for general summary purposes. So when I get a question of, why can't I just get my utility to use the ATB? Well, your utility may know more about the specific financial circumstances of what they can get. That's much more precise than what we're assuming here. So this is a broad assumption. This is not to say that this financial picture is available to every project and is representative of every project. So thanks for the overview. And folks who have more questions about calculation of LCOE or financial assumptions should definitely go to Dave's breakout group on finance. So I think we're now going into a general Q&A period. So if you do have a question that you'd like to cover during Q&A, please type it into the Q&A box, and we'll be happy to address those that are related to everything all together here. And then we will also be breaking out in just a few minutes for more in-depth direct discussion about the breakout group topics. So any questions while we're all together? Anything else that folks would like to address in the main session here? Dave, it looks like maybe we could use a little bit more about the R&D case versus the market case. And I guess before I turn that to you, I'll just say that because the overall purpose of the ATB is primarily to highlight the technology innovations that the research and development community, especially the national lab and DOE communities, are trying to bring to the marketplace. That R&D case is really meant to highlight trends that can be attributable to R&D. However, we recognize that the market and the policies have distinct and very important effects. So Dave, do you want to talk more about those two cases?
I think you did a good, you provided a good summary. I mean, the R&D case is supposed to, remove any distortions that, might occur for, we isolated two specific things. There, I'm sure more you could consider, but we looked at interest rates and we looked at tax credits. Those are things that we felt somewhat comfortable in projecting into the future, or at least looking at the books. And so to avoid confusion as far as like, oh, well, why is the LCOE of wind or solar going up? Well, that's because the tax credits, we assume, are going away. So the R&D case is saying what type of improvements are just from technology perspective are happening, and that's how you could more easily track the progress of the whole of that technology over time. Much more than, CapEx could go up, all these things, but then LCOE sort of supposed to capture sort of everything, or not everything, but a lot of things in its analysis.
And Dave, it looks like there's a question about why are the costs lower in the market than in the R&D case? Okay,
I think, well, the financing costs aren't lower. The LCOE is lower because LCOE, in our LCOE we include the tax credit. So for like solar, the costs in our LCOE formula, the CapEx is reduced by 26% because that's the investment tax credit. So that's why the LCOE is lower. The financing actual costs are cheaper in the R&D case because there's more debt is taken onto a project. Is that
yeah, sounds good.
Clear?
Yeah. Jeff Hoffman, are you out there? Because it looks like there have been a few questions on combined cycle CCS.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Would you like to answer Greg's question about combined cycle and CCS and fuel cells?
Okay. I haven't been staying on the chat, so
I can read it to you. Are all natural gas with carbon capture scenarios a combined cycles tech? The documents seem to indicate fuel cells in the advanced scenario, but there is no reference for baseline data or changes in performance over time. Is the moderate scenario a combined cycle fuel cell or the average of the two?
So the moderate scenario is effectively an average of the two. And the advanced technology scenario is a goals-driven scenario based on achieving the FE, R&D, cost and performance goals for carbon capture on electricity generating systems. And the end state of that is representative of a heat rate and performance of an NGFC system. So there is not, and we try to rationalize this, and we didn't want to, for at least for the current state, we didn't want to have too many multiple pathways, and we stuck with the prior configuration of the ATB to have a separate NGCC pathway independent of the combined advanced technology pathway. So the straight answer is that the advanced technology begins with NGCC with post-combustion capture. It ends with an NGFC with capture as well. And the baseline no R&D scenario is effectively an NGCC with post-combustion capture with learning curve improvements over time. And the moderate scenario is the average of the midpoint for the annual midpoint of each.
Great, thank you. So it looks like we have a couple of late breaking questions. I'll try to answer them quickly. Other folks can help me out here. So in terms of CapEx projections methodology, are these projections built up in a bottom-up manner out to 2030 for all technologies, and post-2030, is that a trend line based on assumed learning curve applied? I think that characterizes in general pretty well what is going on. However, I would recommend that you look at the methodology section of each of the technologies to get a more specific idea. Might we hear about how the new nuclear SMR information was developed? That's pulling in the EIA's information, which we do kind of to have that all in one place. And there's a question about distributed generation versus utility scale projects. And I think it's hard for me to generalize about those technologies. We have several distributed technologies that are now available. And, so I think the answer to that is probably a little bit complex and varied by technology. So Jess, I think we should probably go ahead with the breakout groups. And if folks have more questions, please do attend the breakout groups. And I'd like to thank everyone for attending today.
Laura, this is Jeff Hoffman. Are you still able to hear me?
Yes.
A quick question. And so I admittedly may have missed it early on, but I know that you had mentioned forthcoming updates for some technology configurations to the ATB that aren't included in this present release. I don't know if you mentioned, and I think it might be worthwhile mentioning before we go to the breakout groups, that their FECM fully recognizes that the 90% capture that's used for the fossil technologies is not a technology limited capture rate, and we currently have studies underway that are looking at greater than 90%, and we expect that no later than the next annual release, and ideally sooner than that, that there will be representation of capture rates for fossil technologies greater than 90%.
Great, thanks, Jeff.
Right, we are closing in on our hour mark, so we're going to start transitioning to our interactive topic-specific breakout groups, as we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. In order to free you up to unmute, come on camera, and interact with the ATB team in these breakouts, we'll be jumping over to a Zoom meeting instead of a webinar via a link I'll drop into the chat in just a minute. Once you click the link, Zoom will ask you if you want to leave this webinar and join the breakout group meeting. Simply click leave and join, and you will magically be taken to the breakouts, which are already set up and ready for you. We'll have instructions posted for how to join your chosen breakout group. It's really easy. You basically just select breakout rooms and then grab the group that you'd like. Your ATB breakout hosts are also moving over at the same time. We're all taking this jump together, so please forgive any slight delays. If you end up in a room first, just know your host is fast behind you. And if your call drops at any point, which we know happens, feel free to come back to this webinar via the link in your calendar hold or your email confirmation. Everyone here should have gotten another confirmation about an hour ago, so it should be hopefully near the top of your inbox. Sam Pandy from NREL will be here and can help get you back to your breakouts. We also added this breakout Zoom link to your reminder email that you received this morning, so feel free to use that link directly as well. All right, I will drop the link in the chat now, and we look forward to seeing you in the breakout groups if you're joining us. If not, thank you so much for attending today's webinar. And just a reminder that the presentation and the recording will be posted to the ATB website shortly. Thanks again, and dropping the link in the chat.
Thanks, everyone. Great questions, and we look forward to the discussions in the breakout group. And there's the link.